Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Kate Owens. I'm the Director of the Australian Centre for Climate and Environmental Law here at the Law School. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to our public address, by our George Flannery Fellow, Dr. Michelle Lim, on reimagining the laws of nature, storying rules of hyperconnected futures. As we begin, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. This land, with its rivers, skies, flora, and fauna, has been loved and nurtured by Australia's First Peoples for tens of thousands of years. May we honour, safeguard, and learn from the wisdom of Indigenous custodianship, fostering a future where humans and the more than human community can thrive together. Tonight, Dr. Lim will address a profoundly urgent topic: the rapid disappearance of our more than human kin. The Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services highlights the current catastrophic rate of biodiversity loss and how it's been driven by approaches that prioritise worldviews that emphasise nature's utility and usefulness to humans. Our legal systems, in turn, largely mirror and reinforce these prevailing value systems. And our over-familiarity with categories of decline like threatened and endangered may have desensitised us to the urgency and profound sadness of the situation. So how can we move beyond simple listings and procedural measures and actually create laws that not only address the drivers of extinction, but also foster a deep sense of responsibility and connection to our natural world? How can we make the concept of extinction not just seen, but profoundly felt under the law? Dr. Michelle Lim's visionary work explores the concept of rewriting our legal systems with the more than human. She will challenge us tonight to consider how narrative techniques or storying with nature can help us connect emotionally with nature's intrinsic and relational values and to reimagine the law. Dr. Lim is an Associate Professor of Law and Le Kong Tian Fellow at the Ong Pung Hau School of Law, the Singapore Management University. Michelle's work focuses on futures-oriented biodiversity law aimed at advancing equity and sustainability under conditions of unprecedented environmental change. Michelle is increasingly interested in approaches that allow effective engagement with scholarship, and she explores ways which challenge the form of scholarship, including through creative and imaginative means of expression. Dr. Lim is a 2024 George Flannery Fellow at Sydney Law School, a visiting appointment that recognises Dr. Lim as an outstanding mid-career researcher who contributes and will contribute significantly to the research environment of our school. We also have two wonderful discussants tonight who'll be joining Dr. Lim in this conversation. Danielle Salameyer is a Professor of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Sydney. She's the Acting Director of the Sydney Environment Institute and lead of the Multi-Species Justice Project. Her current research focus is multi-species justice, or how the concepts, practices, and institutionalisation of justice needs to be transformed to take account of ecological realities and the ethical standing of all Earth beings. Danny is the co-lead of the Environmental Justices theme at the SEI. She also lived through the 2019-20 New South Wales bushfires and wrote of her experience of the killing of everything, which she calls omnicide. She's been widely published on this topic, including her book Summertime: Reflections on a Vanishing Future. Dr. Sophie Chow is a Discovery Early Career Researcher Award Fellow and lecturer in the discipline of anthropology at the University of Sydney. Her research investigates the intersections of indigeneity, ecology, capitalism, health, and justice in the Pacific. Sophie is the author of In the Shadow of the Palms: More Than Human Becomings in West Papua, and co-editor of The Promise of Multi-Species Justice. At the University of Sydney, Sophie co-leads the Sydney Environment Institute's Biodiversity Conservation and Culture research theme. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And I'll now hand over to Dr. Lim to deliver her address. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks so much, Kate, and thank you also to Danny and Sophie for being here. We're talking about imagination, but I have to keep pinching myself that I'm not imagining that I have this opportunity to have this wonderful discussion with such brilliant thinkers. So thank you so very, very much. And thank you also to all of you who have taken the time to listen to us tonight. If you take nothing else away from what I'm about to say, I want you to think about these two things. One, that our current dominant legal systems are not fit for purpose for dealing with the very real challenges of extinction and global environmental change. And second, that imagination and creativity are key to hope. And so I'll be talking about imagination, reimagining the laws of nature, but also about hope. And to give you a bit of a sense of what else I'll be talking about tonight, I thought I'd start with a haiku that I wrote on New Year's Eve last year. And it goes like this. Each drop, a ripple, concentric circles collide. Tears spiral to hope. And when I look back on quite a lot of my work, I noticed that this idea of hope does come through in a lot of it. And yet, when I was invited in November last year to the Swedish Academy of Sciences to a project on the empirics of hope in the Anthropocene led by Henrik Oosterblom and Diante Ningrum, I still went to this gathering with a sense of skepticism, because so often we are sold this idea of hope, which is really toxic positivity in the age of neoliberalism. But what I came away from this workshop with was not only a profound sense of hope, but what hope means or should mean. And it was at this workshop that I not only became familiar with the work of Maria Oyala, but I got to meet Maria as well. She was at the workshop, and the Spanish speakers amongst you, even though Maria is not Spanish, the Spanish speakers amongst you will know that Oyala itself in Spanish means hope. And Maria defines hope as follows: that it's a positive feeling about the future that is evoked by positive, albeit uncertain, beliefs about desired goals and active coping in the face of hardships. Professor Oyala writes, without difficulties, there's no need for hope. And this work speaks to me because it provides the avenue for hope to be distinguished from neoliberal toxic positivity. Instead of pretending everything is okay when it clearly is not, instead of capitalizing on insecurities to sell a product or to increase a stock price, Oyala's definition allows recognition of and reckoning with the uncertainty, fear, and grief of our current times, while purposively seeking and creating pathways to desirable futures. With the very real hardship of global extinction, I argue that form is as important as content when exploring active coping amidst planetary scale socio-ecological upheaval. So much of my recent work involves the use of creative writing as legal method. I contemplate what it would mean to rewrite legal systems with the more than human, as Kate alluded to earlier. I consider how storying with nature may allow reimagination of law, but importantly, reimagination of dominant destructive ways of understanding nature. I argue that creative writing as a methodology in legal scholarship and other disciplines could contribute to the realization of radically hopeful futures and the normalization of human nature relations. I'm very interested in the work of Emily Boulot and Josh Sterling, who talk about how dominant legal systems are essentially about use. The starting point is the use of nature, and law comes in to provide certain parameters around allowable harm. And as Kate alluded to, when you look at it in the context of biodiversity, again, this sort of doing things but not really getting things done in the form of lists. You see that in a range of biodiversity conventions, you see that in national strategies and national legislation around biodiversity. Lists, which over time just end up categorizing, as the lists get longer and longer, categorizing how more and more species are hurtling towards extinction. So what I hope to do is to engage with not a tinkering with changing a word here and there and minor amendments to the law, but completely rethinking what law is and how we might reshape that thing which is law, which really only reflects a certain idea of law that is projected in dominant colonial legal systems. At the same time, recognizing that in legal scholarship already, similar work has been done over many years. So I'm thankful to Liz Fisher for drawing to my attention the law and literature movement, where legal scholars engage with literature and therefore draw out the underlying values about legal systems that's coming out from the literature. What I want you to do is something quite different. It's not just about encouraging lawyers to read and write about literature, but instead to create creative writing or other forms of creativity itself to reimagine what law could be. And at the same time, when I started doing some of this work, people engage with it in different ways. But one way that I think some people have engaged with it is due to the fact that our universities increasingly encourage us to #impact and therefore communicate the science. And this idea of, oh, okay, you're telling a story about this thing that you're doing research on, and therefore, you know, the wider publics will know about it. And yes, that is a very helpful and a very important subset of what's being done here. But my key argument is not to write in creative ways because I want people beyond academia to engage with it, which is a good thing. It's a profoundly good thing. But more importantly, because of how it changes the way we, as part of the academy, it changes the way we think, because many disciplines tell us we need to write in a particular way, to think in a particular way. And I was just talking to Danny before this, and she described this as academic writing is writing with hiccups. And I'm going to use that again as we go forward. And similarly, last bit over a week ago, I was at the World Biodiversity Forum in Davos, a wonderful event where, in addition to having scientists, philosophers, economists, lawyers, they also had this very important part of art and science. And the theme of the forum was science into action. And it was there that I got to hear about this work of an artist called Thijs Biersteker. And he does really good work where he takes data, scientific concepts, and uses that to engage artistically and bring science to this idea of wider publics. And there's so many things that I agree with what Thijs is doing. And we even have the same genre of jokes. Thijs, for example, said, there's something even scarier than climate change, and that is engaging with our emotions. And yes, I've made that genre of joke myself, but what I'm going to talk about now is where, and because I'm imagining that Thijs probably wouldn't be listening to a law-related presentation, but where I feel a profound disagreement with some of the messaging that was coming from his presentation. And that links to this idea that engaging creatively is something we do only to make our work more interesting for it to be consumed in a particular way. One thing that he said was, scientists sometimes are concerned about having their work going into art, concerned that the nuance of what's being done gets left out. And therefore, Thijs's response was, nobody cares. And this is where my profound objection is, because I do care about the nuance. I do care about how thinking creatively actually allows us to expand the ways in which we understand the world, and you're not straitjacketed by what your discipline tells you you can do. So although I agree with much of what he's saying, I'm also encouraging us, and as us, I'm characterizing that as academia, to write creatively because of how it helps us to think before how it helps us to communicate beyond particular spheres of academia. And the endpoint is very similar to that of what Thijs is talking about, because as he talks about, engaging with emotion allows us to have shared human understandings of ways in which we see the world. So what exactly do I mean when I say I want you to write creatively? Well, I'm going to show you, and I'm going to show you by drawing on a Griffith Law Review article, and then I'll come back to conclude in a way quite similar to how I started with a poem. I'll conclude with a longer poem, a little bit of slam poetry. But first, to an endling novella from the Griffith Law Review. In case you don't know what an endling is defined as the last surviving individual of a plant or animal species. In other words, the very last individual before the entire species goes extinct. So in this Griffith Law Review piece, I ask, why do endlings, no matter how otherwise uncharismatic, tug at our conscience? Why are we drawn to the plight of the endling at the point of biological futility? Why do we seek to know final individuals even by name? Benjamin, the last thylacine; Martha, the final passenger pigeon; or Lonesome George, the ultimate Pinta Island tortoise? Why are endlings given a level of attention that eluded its king. Perhaps the last of a kind allows significant personal connection. Is it the stark confrontation with the endpoint of our collective unsustainable actions, or is it rarity and fleetingness that force us to look anew? I suspect the reasons differ for each of us and yet encompass some or all of the above. In the Endling novella I am about to read to you, I explore the power of the Endling and ask how the last of a kind might help us develop an empathy with the non-human and dream a new and better relationship with the earth. So in this Endling novella, I adopt something very similar to Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Those of you who are children of the 80s and perhaps haven't read as much literature will recognize this as a Scrooge McDuck version. But similarly, you have the ghosts of Christmas past, ghosts of Christmas present, and ghosts of Christmas future, taking Scrooge McDuck around to look at different choices that have been made in life. So in this novella, I look at the spirit of Endling past, the spirit of Endling recent, and the spirit of Endling future. For the purposes of tonight, I will focus on the spirit of Endling recent, who is Gump, a Christmas Island skink, and who recently went extinct. So we pick up with Gump, and instead of having Scrooge McDuck and a different spirit taking Scrooge McDuck around, you have human and you have ghost, who are the two main protagonists going around through time and also through space. And we're meeting human and ghost just as they've just left talking to the last thylacine, and now they are going to meet the second of the three endlings. And it goes like this. Wow, I think I'm going to throw up, groans human. Your conscience catching up to you, human? Teases ghost. Huh? No, ghost, travel sickness, protests human. Human blinks in the tropical vista and takes a deep inhale of the salty sea breeze. Wow. Talk about a sight for sore eyes. Where's this? Tahiti? Good guess, human, says Ghost, genuinely impressed. Similar latitude to Tahiti, an island, but not of the same ocean, different colonial histories, at a detention center and a quarantine facility. And I suppose you could almost say we are in Tahiti. What's this about? Asks human, pointing to a large yellow road sign with big black lettering. Awas, caution, crabs crossing in wet season. That's right, human, says Ghost. Christmas Island, the year is 2014. Don't mind the sign, it's the wrong time of year for the crab migration. Come this way. Now I want you to do a bit of imagining and imagine that across the screen right now are the words Gump, Elvis impersonator, and the last Christmas Island forest skink. 31 May 2014, Reptile House, Christmas Island. Ghost and human amble down the road to the reptile house. They stand inside a covered open air area. The area is closed in with wide mesh fencing, which extends to the roof. The corrugated polycarbonate roofing lets in natural sunlight. Under the roof sit rows of boxes that resemble chicken coops. Ghost leads human up to a box labeled Gump, Emoia Nativitatis, the home of the world's last remaining Christmas Island forest skink. In the box, Gump stands about 7 centimeters tall. The rest of her 20-centimeter length is all tail. Her chocolate brown skin shimmers in the sunlight. Gump has fashioned a pale leaf into a cape which is draped luxuriously across the shoulders. The inside of the cape is bright red. Then, out of nowhere, Gump grabs a long twig and sways with it as if it is a microphone stand. Into the twig, she sings, "Let's rock, everybody, let's rock. Everybody in the old cell block was dancing to the jailhouse rock, dancing to the jailhouse rock, dancing to the jailhouse rock." Thank you, thank you. I do love performing that little number, says Gump, taking a deep bow. Kind of reminds me of all that's going on around me. You know what I mean. Gump turns to the audience. Today's my last day, you know. Yes, my last day on the island. Well, last day on the planet, actually. Not to be too dramatic, but today is the end of the line for Amoya Nativitatis. Yes, one more sleep and there'll be no more Christmas Island foreign skink on this earth. But don't let that get you down. Let's play some music, shall we? A 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4. Don't be cruel to a heart that's true. Gump continues with a few more Elvis tunes. She then lounges on the large piece of driftwood that takes up much of the box. It's a bit as if she's being interviewed in front of a live studio audience. You know, when you're on stage, you can't let the mood get too sad. I mean, this gig is hard enough, being a woman in a male-dominated field of Elvis impersonation. I can't lie, says Gump. This whole end of the line thing is getting to me. Just because I'm the last Emoya Nativitatis, I'm not saying I'm special. We used to have these teeny tiny microbats on the island, huge lot of attitude, but they were so small, it was hard to take them seriously. They were smaller than our kids. They had some funny name. Christmas Island. It's true. Cracks me up every time saying it. Yeah, they're gone now. Forever. August 2009 was the last time anyone saw one. And did you hear about Bramblecay Melomies? I've seen pictures. Cute little mousy thing. They lived on a sandy island in the northern Great Barrier Reef. Well, until they didn't. Last one also seen in 2009. First mammal to go extinct due to climate change. Apparently. Climate change? We didn't even get the chance to test ourselves against climate change. Not that we didn't have enough to worry about. Those fucking yellow crazy ants, fucking crazy, I tell you. Them super colonies are giving the crabs a hard time too. Not nice. It's not their bite so much, but the spray, whoosh, formic acid, oh, horrible stuff. And it's not just the ants. All these other new enemies that you humans have brought upon us. Cats, rats, giant centipedes, wolf snakes. You would think we were living in a horror movie, but it's real life. Hey, you know what? 5 months ago, I made it onto a national threatened species list. Big deal, maybe. I mean, they finally got around to adding me to the list, but here's the funny thing, right? The conservation advice, they seriously wrote it like any other conservation advice. Like they didn't grasp the gravity of this situation. Wait for it, wait for it. This is how it goes, right? A captive population of this species has been established in holding cages on Christmas Island. The captive population consists of one individual. I mean, hello, one individual makes a population nowadays? You can't make this sort of thing up. The captive population consists of one individual. That's me. Just poor old Gump alone in this great big world. Ghost and human have been standing outside the box for close to an hour. Ghost executes a shallow bow in Gump's direction and turns to leave. Human follows suit. Wait, leads Gump. Are you leaving? Ghost and human nod while offering sympathetic smiles. It's okay, whispers Gump. I'm used to it. And from there, Ghost takes human to meet the spirit of Endling yet to come. Writing in 2013, 9 months before the death of Gump, John Wojnarski and Hal Codger observed that individually, Gump is an indistinguished and inconsequential lizard, but she has now become a talisman, marking the finality and proximity of extinction. Extinction is a chain. The last link of the chain is the death of the last individual. The fable of the Endling novella is an invitation for us to learn the lessons of the past so they do not continue as the failings of our futures. My hope is that Endlings have not lived in vain, that they can spur us to understand not only the interconnected links of extinction, but ultimately our entanglement in webs of causation and responsibility. And it is from there that I move to further consider in another form questions of responsibility, but also drawing the link back to the concentric circles colliding that I started with in the beginning of this presentation. So I was writing this piece at the beginning of 2021. It would have been when the first Omicron wave had come through, and somehow not being able to travel made me think about the differences in which I am able to travel the world compared to ancestors only 1 or 2 generations removed. So my grandparents on my father's side moved from southern China, Teochew and Hakka moved from southern China to Malaysia, Malaysian Borneo, and on my mum's side, a few more generations back, apparently there's Scottish, Cornish, English heritage. Someone said there might be a French pirate in there as well, but these ancestors then moved to the continent some of us now know as Australia. And only in very short generational time, a very different reality of movement from what I am able to experience today, for better or for worse, compared to that of my ancestors. So it was all these thoughts and also what's going on in the world that drew me to what I'm about to share with you right now. And this piece is called Out of Time, question mark. Black, rectangle, silver, circle. Black hands trace a silver face. In my childhood home, my grandmother's clock hangs in a case. When it works, the silver pendulum swings back and forth, tick tock, tick tock. My grandmother, I should call her Ama. Ama is, after all, Teochew for grandma. She was my father's mother. Ama, it sounds fitting, yet other. She is my grandmother. I know her not, but I can imagine. You can't make me stop. I look at Ama's black and white portrait. I see my twin sister's face. Funny how image allows us to connect time and place. Lately, I've been thinking about Ama. What makes her tick? All the stories she'd stop. What would she say it taboo to speak of the end and to speak about clocks? Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. Ring! Our phones, the new pocket clocks, the alarm sounds, but nobody blinks. Someone else will deal with it, or so we all think. A rate, a pace, a planetary acceleration. Some have called great a pursuit of growth that does not abate, speeding up the now, before, and yet to come, yet always too slow for real work to be done. Lately, we've been thinking about curves, the ones we're meant to flatten to give us more time, bend a biodiversity curve to conserve more than our kind. Exponential curves of development we hear countries boast, yet for 50 years the meadows sing of the limits to growth. Lately, I've been thinking about this moment in time. The best of times, the worst of times. A billionaire made every 26 hours while a virus takes what we thought was ours. Lives, livelihoods, life disrupted, symptoms of this world constructed on falsehoods that we could have it all, focused on the individual, now ignoring the fall. Individual responsibility in a time of great response ability, where children learn not only their ABCs, but also if today it is Alpha, Delta, or Omicron, keeping them from the swings and see soars, and from grandma's house at Christmas time. At this time of me, myself, and mine in this world of accelerated histories, accelerated time, I am told if I just tread lightly on this earth, the woes of the planet would simply disperse. Individual responsibility in a time of great response ability, yet no one responsible. Just tread lightly, apparently. Go on, give it a go. Tiptoe, 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 tipping point, crash. Unprecedented, the cry as the records are slashed. Is it too late to hope, to speak of joy? No, not that which you buy, for no shiny new toy can be the antidote we need in our souls. Let's return to a present where knowing is whole. Is it too late to imagine worlds, other planets which phallic-shaped vessels may conquer? No, this rock, our rock, that we care with and not smother. Not just the rhyme. Didn't we call her our mother? Thank you. And it is now that I am delighted to hear from Sophie.
I want to start by thanking Michelle for that fabulous address, thanking Danny for joining me and offering responses, and to Michelle K. Owens for bringing us together in this space, and everyone who's joining us online for being part of the gift that is this conversation. So I'm coming to this short response already totally infused and enthused by a workshop that Michelle led prior to this address, and where she started to get us thinking seriously about multi-species storytelling, about more than human narratives, about the power of describing more than human worlds, but also describing them through the use of sound and voice and texture and touch, and in which, as with your address, brought us to think along and with edges of all kinds, edges of extinction and endangerment, but also the edges of our disciplines that enable us or disallow us from telling particular stories about the world, determining who we get to story with, for, and about, and then what these stories do in the world that they purport to represent. Your address amplifies and oxygenates so much of what I was hearing earlier from you around this relationship between form and content, and the importance of dissolving them as separate realms of inquiry, in a way that I will not even attempt to emulate in my response, but that I think offers us a really powerful optic through which to challenge dominant legal framework that, as you noted, are glaringly unfit for purpose. Your address is an invitation to reframe the imagination as, in your words, the foundation of hope, to harness the powers of creative writing in interrogating and renegotiating coexistence with each other and with the rest of life. And it's also an invitation to stay with and take seriously that powerful provocation you make in asking us, what would it mean really to take and to rewrite legal systems and scripts with the more than human? And I say powerful provocation because in bringing storytelling into the realm of the law, you're opening pathways for reframing the law and its possibilities that I myself, as an environmental anthropologist, have not so far thought of particularly seriously, critically, or deeply. If anything, I've tended to steer away from thinking about law and justice in their relationship. What you're offering us is something different. The law as storytelling, the law as organism, the law is something that has a pulse and that offers different kinds of possibilities for coexisting across species lines and within terrains of power and privilege that bring into the fold both multi-species worlds and also multi-species writs. So I want to return in my brief response specifically to your invitation to approach the, quote, imagination as a foundation of hope. And as I was listening to your address, I was thinking with the likes of Arjuna Padurai, who talks about the capacity to aspire that is differently distributed across species and human communities. I was thinking also of the work of the anthropologist Ghassan Haj, who talks about hope as a differential, again, returning us to this question of uneven distributions of abilities and affordances to hope in the first instance. But I was also thinking with some work that I've been doing with a wonderful Samoan colleague, Dion Inari, in a paper on the imagination and climate change that you, in fact, very generously and also generatively engaged with in your fabulous 2021 paper, Fiction as Legal Method, a paper that I would encourage everyone to read and then reread and reread again. And it's really through that work with Dion and your scholarship that I identified, a shared recognition that the imagination and the climate crisis are in fact profoundly entangled. Climate change, Amitav Ghosh writes, is nothing less than a crisis of culture and thus of imagination. In a similar vein, the journalist David Wallace Wells has described the climate crisis as the tragic result of an incredible, quote, failure of the imagination. But of course, the imagination itself is a battlefield, as Ruha Benjamin has written, one that entails multiple conflicting and in friction imaginaries of what the world is, should be, or could be. Capitalist and colonial imaginaries too play a part in shaping these visions of the world, and often in ways, as you write so beautifully, are anchored in and perpetuate a logic of human mastery over a nature that is recast as the passive material substrate, one that is meaningful only to the extent that it is useful to certain humans. What your address invited me to think with more deeply was an understanding of imaginaries as relational, as storied, as multisensory, as emplaced, as reflexive, and also as radical. Radical in the sense perhaps articulated by Hiile Hobart and her co-author Stephanie Maroney to talk about kinds of cares or imaginaries that are offering glimmers of hope, even amidst precarious worlds, and even as these might remain embedded within systemic inequalities and hegemonic power structures. Radical imaginations, radical hopes, such as the ones that you are writing with, offer a kind of strategic audacity, perhaps, a refusal not to care and to imagine or to hope, despite dark histories and potentially darker futures. These are forms of radical imagination that can perhaps help counter what many of us experience as the crippling force of political apathy and the sense of helplessness/hopelessness that often accompanies the seemingly insurmountable scales of loss and destruction that surround and haunt us. Earlier today, we were talking about fact and fiction, and I was thinking about how your invitation to reimagine the imagination as the foundation of hope is also a question of reimagining the monopoly over what counts as fact and as fiction. How we might forge a kind of radical inclusion that recognizes that the law itself is also fiction, as SCI PhD student Hannah de la Bosca invited us to consider earlier in the workshop. And so with that, I'm left with questions that are vital, I think. I'm left with questions around what it will take to coalitionally and across disciplines challenge the systems and institutions that dictate who has the license to story and imagine and hope and who does not. The question of whose imaginaries count in the world and on and from what grounds. And I'm using grounds here both in the literal sense, but also in the sense of institutional grounds and epistemic grounds. I'm left wondering how we might ensure that multi-species stories and legal systems are heard and heeded, particularly indigenous onto epistemologies, where the law of the land has always been core to more than human coexistence. And I'm wondering also, of course, how all of this translates into actual legal documents, and whether the beautiful craft of storytelling, the poetics that you bring to us, acts as a companion to legal text, or whether there's a way of embedding them within legal scripts themselves. And again, what that will take, both within and beyond academia. I don't think any single person can answer all of these questions, nor do all of this monumental and critical work. But I certainly know that your scholarship is helping us all on this path of rethinking the law as more than human story making, and in ways that are more critical, more creative, and more capacious. And I think what your address also brought to me is the question of how we might interweave within the law, not just the imperatives of sanctions and obligations, and a calling out of destruction and disaster, but also wonder, pleasure, and play, and what space we can make for that within the law as something that also has a pulse. Thanks so much, Michelle. Sincere.
Thank you, Kate, Michelle, and Sophie. And my remarks actually flow really perfectly from your last comments, Sophie, because what struck me, I spend a lot of time thinking, reflecting, feeling with the endling, and have often wondered, as you reflected at the beginning of your address, Michelle, what is it about the endling that sits so heavily with us? And I think one answer to that question is the experience of loneliness of the endling, and of the many names that have been coined for this age. The one that speaks most powerfully to me is the Eremocene, the age of loneliness. And I wonder whether part of the resonance of the endling is with our own loneliness. And you spoke at the beginning of your talk about the fear of our emotions. And I think the fear of encountering in a confrontational way the truth of our own loneliness in our age. It is so great. And so perhaps one way to encounter that loneliness is sideways through an encounter of what the joy of relationship, the desire of belonging. And so I'm going to, in the spirit of your invitation, not give in to the force of academic protocols, but rather to give in to the force of your creativity. And I'm going to read a little bit from my own writing where I attempt to speak from the desire of relationship. Iris Murdoch famously described a moment when gazing out the window, quote, in an anxious and resentful frame of mind, oblivious to my surroundings, brooding perhaps on some damage done to my prestige, end of quote. She observed a kestrel hovering. She describes the shift thus, and I quote, in a moment, everything is altered. There is nothing but kestrel, end of quote. The attention she describes has a distinctive character involving not merely a shift to another as the object of perception, but a type of revelation. Whereas before one perceives the world around one through lenses of sense-making that reduce the otherness of an other to what is available within the lexicon of rehearsed knowledge, when one intends in the way Murdoch is evoking, the truth of another as themselves or in their world can appear. Murdoch's assertion that attention can give rise to an appreciation of right response, of ethical response, rests on her view that what impedes our accurately apprehending another in the first place is the shadow of ourselves, our lonely selves, with all of our categories and preconceived expectations, as well as our ultimate lonely concern for ourselves. In its sheer magnificence, the kestrel displaces the machinations of the lonely ego and even the ego's maneuvers to displace itself. That doesn't mean there's no activity on the part of the self, for the very possibility of apprehending nothing but kestrel requires an open-minded attention. The revelation occurs at a meeting place where otherness touches upon openness, drawing the human who is attending beyond the boundaries of knowing and being it had always occupied. The carpet of birdsong has a tendency to recede into the background, at least into my background when I am preoccupied. But when the black cockatoos are shouting at each other as they enter the valley, there is no ignoring them, no mistaking their insistence that they have something to say about what is happening, although probably not to me. Even when the cockatoos are way beyond my sight, their conversation, which so often sounds like a robust argument, their pronouncements or their announcements demand attention. When they do come into my field of vision, they are as impressive as you'd expect them to be from what you have been hearing. More like fighter pilots than gliders. They head for some trees. When I look up, I can barely discern them huge and incontestable in the upper branches. Bird and branch, dark in relief against the searing light of the Australian sun. Just as I have managed to make out their shape and the yellow of their tail feathers and to feel that extraordinary satisfaction of catching them in my sight, they are off again, and I after them, only earthbound. I walk down here following their path north because now they have intrigued and seduced. 3 and then 4 and then 6 or 7, 10, 14 more. A big mob. Perhaps there are grubs in the trunks or fruit on the branches they've decided will make a tasty meal. Perhaps they're just out for the lark of it. They certainly look like they're having a blast. Now I need to crane my neck to see them because they have landed on the upper branches of the 2 she oaks standing behind the house where the chickens sleep at night. I look up and they definitely seem to be looking down at me, although unlike me, who has to squint intently and still can't see very much, they have no trouble making me out. And it's surely not the impressiveness of my cries or the brilliance of my movement across the ground that has brought them here. They know that this is where I throw seeds every morning and every evening for the wild ducks, and they have come to check out if there is anything in it for them. And although they don't likely give a toss about me, that doesn't stop them offering me the most extraordinary gift of gaining a perspective on myself as nothing more and nothing less than a seed tosser. Thank you. Michelle.
Michelle, Sophie, Danny, thank you so much for the most moving and phenomenal presentations and performances tonight. In acknowledging the stories of endlings, the last of their kind, you've brought the reality of extinction into sharper focus for all of us. To face the fact that these powerful stories of endlings past and those yet to come make us face the stark reality of extinction head on and confront our responsibilities to the more than human world. As we draw tonight to a close, let us all commit to working towards legal frameworks that fully reflect the profound loss that extinction represents. Let us draw on our own inherent creativity. Let us strive to create laws that not only acknowledge but actively combat the drivers of biodiversity loss, that enable us to move from mere recognition of threat to decisive action against extinction. As Sophie would put it, laws with a pulse. I'd like to extend a huge thank you again to Michelle, Danny, and Sophie, and to you, our audience, for embarking on this exploration tonight and opening your minds to the possibilities that lie in redefining our legal frameworks and value systems with the more than human to create a more harmonious coexistence with all forms of life. Good night to you all.